Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. You ready for a deep dive today?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. We are tackling Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. If you had a chance to look at this one yet.
I have, and it's a big one, very dense, lots to unpack, but really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit of a beast, but in a good way. So much to think about. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think it's helpful to get a sense of the overall argument. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, Acemoglu and Robinson, they're arguing that it's not geography or resources or even culture that determines whether a nation succeeds or fails.
It's all about institutions.
You got it. Institutions are the key. Think of them like the software that runs a nation's hardware. They set the rules of the game.
Okay, so help me understand this. What do they mean by institutions? Like, what are we actually talking about here?
So we're talking about things like the legal system, property rights, how power is distributed. Is it concentrated in the hands of a few, or is it more broadly shared? How do things actually work in this nation?
And crucially, how do those institutions shape incentives? How do they influence the way people behave, the choices they make?
Exactly. And this is where the authors draw a really important distinction between what they call extractive institutions and inclusive institutions.
Okay, so extractive versus inclusive. Break that down for me. What's the difference?
All right. Imagine a kingdom, right, where the king and his buddies, they hoard all the wealth, they make all the rules to benefit themselves, and they actively prevent anyone else from climbing the ladder. They don't want to share the power or the pie.
Sounds kind of like a recipe for disaster, or at least disaster for anyone who's not the king or his buddies.
Exactly. And that's extractive institutions in a nutshell. They're designed to extract wealth and resources from the many and funnel it to the few. They're not exactly known for promoting widespread prosperity.
Okay, so then on the flip side, we have inclusive institutions.
Right. So think of a bustling marketplace, right, where everyone has a fair shot at setting up shop, at competing, at succeeding based on their own merits.
So a level playing field.
More or less, yeah. Inclusive institutions are about creating a system where hard work is actually rewarded, where you have secure property rights, where you have access to education, health care.
So you have opportunities to improve your lot in life, regardless of where you started.
Precisely. It's about creating a system that incentivizes participation, innovation, progress, but from everyone, not just the select few.
That makes a lot of sense. And this is making me think about that part of the book where they talk about the virtuous cycle that inclusive institutions can set in motion.
Oh, yeah, that's a key idea.
You know, where economic growth leads to greater prosperity, which in turn strengthens those institutions, which leads to even more growth and prosperity. It's like this upward spiral of, well, virtuousness.
Yeah. And the authors argue that this isn't just some theoretical utopia. They say we've seen it happen throughout history.
Yeah. Give me an example. Where has this virtuous cycle actually played out?
Well, they point to the Industrial Revolution in England. And yeah, it definitely had its problems.
Yeah.
But the emergence of more inclusive institutions, like, for example, giving property rights to a much wider segment of society and having a political system that was at least somewhat responsive to the needs of a growing middle class, that played a crucial role.
Interesting. So it wasn't perfect, but those more inclusive elements help to unleash those unprecedented levels of innovation and economic growth.
Exactly. It wasn't the only factor, of course, but it was a key ingredient. And that's what makes this whole idea of inclusive institutions so compelling. It's not just about being fair, it's about creating the conditions for widespread prosperity and progress.
So that's the good news. Inclusive institutions, virtuous cycle. Sounds pretty great so far.
It does.
But there's always a but, right?
Why?
Right. There's got to be a catch. What's the flip side here?
Well, the flip side is that nations often get stuck in what the authors call institutional traps.
Institutional traps. Okay, now you've got to explain this one. What does that mean?
Think about it this way. If you're part of that small elite that's benefiting from an extractive system, are you really all that motivated to change things? Even if it might mean greater prosperity for everyone in the long run, we've got it good. Why change anything?
Probably not, especially if those changes mean you might end up losing some of your power and privilege.
Exactly. It's human nature, right?
Right.
And that's how nations can get stuck in these vicious cycles of extraction. Power gets concentrated, wealth gets siphoned off, and any attempt at reform is met with resistance.
So it's like this self-perpetuating system where the very institutions that are holding a nation back become almost impossible to change. Sounds pretty bleak.
It can be. They use the example of the Congo. You had this brutal exploitation under Belgian colonialism. I mean, truly awful stuff. And then later on, you had these corrupt dictatorships.
So the institutions were designed to extract wealth for Belgium.
Yes. And they were never truly replaced with anything remotely inclusive. It's heartbreaking, but it's a perfect illustration of how these extractive institutions, these traps, can persist for generations. It's a cycle that can be really hard to break.
Yeah, and these situations can go on for a long time. But then again, there are these moments when change does happen, right? And it can happen pretty dramatically sometimes.
Right, like something shifts and the seemingly unshakable becomes a lot less so.
Yeah. And the authors talk about these moments in history where that change happens, where those institutional traps are somehow sprung. They call them critical junctures, like these turning points.
Critical junctures. I like that. So what are we talking about here? Are these like these big dramatic events that kind of shake everything up? Or can they be more subtle than that?
Well, they can definitely be big and dramatic. Wars, revolutions, those are definitely up there on the list. But they can also be more subtle shifts, like a new technology emerging that disrupts the existing order.
Okay, so give me an example of a critical juncture, something that really illustrates how this whole thing works. Okay, well, think about the Black Death. The bubonic plague wiped out a huge chunk of Europe's population.
Talk about a critical juncture.
Right. And its impact, it went way beyond just the body count, the sheer number of people who died. It shook up the social order. You had this feudal system, right, where peasants were basically tied to the land.
Right, very strict social hierarchy.
Right. And the Black Death, it just threw a wrench in that whole system. Suddenly, labor was scarce, peasants had more leverage, they could demand more, and you started to see cracks in the foundation of those extractive institutions that had been in place for centuries.
So even though it was this horrific tragedy, this critical juncture, it actually opened up a space for change.
Exactly. It created a window of opportunity, a possibility for a different way of organizing society. And while those changes didn't happen overnight, the Black Death, it planted the seeds for a more dynamic, eventually a more inclusive system. And of course, those openings, they don't have to be pandemics.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah, but they can be all sorts of things. Think about the printing press, Gutenberg.
Okay, now that's an interesting one.
Right. And it wasn't just about making books cheaper. This was about the spread of information, the democratization of knowledge. No longer could a select few control the narrative.
The elites couldn't just decide what people knew and didn't know anymore.
Exactly. And you can draw a straight line from Gutenberg to the Reformation to the Enlightenment. All of these massive shifts in how people thought about the world, about power, about religion.
So a seemingly simple invention, a critical juncture, leads to this cascade of changes that reshape the entire world.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what are the critical junctures happening right now? What's going on today that might seem small but could trigger huge institutional shifts down the line?
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Thinking about history this way. But okay, I have to ask, if these critical junctures create opportunities for positive change, for breaking free from extractive systems, why don't we see it happen more often? Why do some societies seem to seize those moments and others just, I don't know, they just kind of default back to the old ways?
That's the million-dollar question. And this is where the authors introduce another really important concept, creative destruction.
Ooh, creative destruction. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What is that?
All right, imagine a world where the only cars on the road are these clunky, gas-guzzling behemoths. They're all we know.
Not exactly a pretty picture, environmentally speaking.
Yeah, not at all. But now, along comes this new technology, electric cars. Sleek, efficient, better for the planet. You'd think everyone would be thrilled, right?
Sign me up. Where can I get my electric car?
Well, hold on a second. See, there's a whole industry built around those gas guzzlers. The manufacturers, oil companies, the mechanics, they've all got a lot to lose if everyone suddenly switches to electric cars.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. So it's not just about the innovation itself, it's about who benefits from the old way of doing things.
Right. They're threatened by this new technology, even if it's objectively better for everyone in the long run.
Because it disrupts the existing power structures.
Exactly. So what do? They resist, they lobby, they spread misinformation, they do whatever they can to stifle the competition and protect their interests.
They try to prevent that creative destruction from happening.
Exactly.
Because it is destructive, even when it's ultimately a good thing. It shakes things up, it disrupts the status quo.
Yeah. Think about the Industrial Revolution again. It brought about these incredible advances in technology and productivity, but it also led to massive displacement of workers, completely upended traditional ways of life.
And created new forms of inequality.
Exactly. So creative destruction, it's this powerful force, but it's not always pretty. It's messy. It creates winners and losers.
It's like this double-edged sword.
It is, yeah, and it really gets to the heart of why progress isn't always linear, why good ideas don't always win out immediately.
Right, because there are these deeply entrenched interests, these power dynamics that come into play.
Exactly. It's not just about having a better mousetrap, it's about navigating those forces of creative destruction.
Which is more easily said than done. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Extractive versus inclusive institutions, critical junctures, creative destruction. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, but I think the real power of why nations fail is that it gives you this new framework, this lens for understanding the world around us.
Right. It's like those magic eye posters. You have to kind of stare at it for a while, but then suddenly you see the hidden image, the deeper pattern.
Exactly. And those patterns, they're not just some abstract academic concept. They have real-world implications. They help us understand why some countries prosper while others struggle.
And hopefully they can give us some clues about how to build a better future.
That's the hope. Okay, so let's get practical for a second. If we as individuals are reading this book, we're thinking about these ideas, and we want to actually do something with this knowledge, where do we even begin?
Yeah, that's the big question. What can we actually do to promote more inclusive institutions to make the world a better place?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways from the book is the importance of education and awareness. The more people who understand these dynamics, the more likely they are to demand better from their leaders, to hold them accountable.
It's about empowering people to become active participants in shaping their own societies, not just passive bystanders.
Exactly. And that means thinking critically, questioning assumptions, not just accepting the status quo because that's the way it's always been done.
And it's about being willing to challenge those in power, to push for change, even when it's difficult.
Absolutely. Now, the authors are very clear that there are no easy answers here, no one-size-fits-all solutions. But I do think they offer a sense of cautious optimism.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. They're not saying that history is destiny. They're saying we have the power to shape our own institutions, but it's going to take work.
Exactly. And it's going to take a collective effort. It's not enough for just a few people to get it. We need a critical mass of people who understand these dynamics and are willing to fight for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with plenty to ponder. We've only just scratched the surface of this book, so we encourage you to check it out for yourself, continue exploring these ideas.
And let us know what you think.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and until next time, happy deep diving.